Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. It's been a long time. It feels like forever. I know we took Monday off. So if you were expecting a live video on Monday, check for the recording that I posted. I actually posted it on Friday. It's a drawing of a bird, so it's kind of a bonus episode that we did. So if you're new, my name's Scott. I'm with Artist Network, and we are here to draw together. This is the subject we'll be working with today. This is the sunflower. If you're looking for the reference photo, you can find it in the description underneath the video. So you can open up that link. I find that it actually works best to work from it on the screen. The color is just a bit richer. You have a stronger kind of contrast range there. I have it printed up here, but I also have a projection in front of me that I'll be working with. Digging right into it, we're going to look at the materials. So I've got this cotton rag paper that I'm working with. This is a Hahnemuhle Skiza paper. So this is about 8.5 by 11 inches. We're going to be working with charcoal today. These are 4Bs and 6Bs. This is a 4B pencil that I've kind of shaved away the wood casing to expose the core. I'll be using that a lot. I have it sharpened on both ends, just so I have extra sharp pieces to work with. This is my 6B if I need something a little bit softer and darker. I've got vine charcoal as well. These are soft vine charcoals. I'm going to be using this to begin with, and then I've got my kneaded and rubber erasers. So if you've been following this series, these are pretty standard materials for me to use. I've been doing a lot of graphite lately. I thought I'd switch to charcoal. If you're following along and you do have graphite, I think a lot of what we're going to be covering here is going to apply. Just know that it may not quite get the same value range that that charcoal will. So kind of play around with different materials and see what works for you, but I think a lot of the concepts are going to hold true. If you do have graphite, you can do the same thing with your pencil. So I just use a razor blade to kind of carve away this and expose a bit more of that core. And what that allows you to do is to cover a larger area than if you just have a really finely sharpened pencil. I also have my trusty shading stump here that we'll be using a lot. So this was a request from quite a few people to do another flower. I chose to do a sunflower. I found this photo online on a site called Pixabay, which is full of free reference images. And I chose this image specifically because of two key qualities to it. One of them is that the positioning of the sunflower is such that it's kind of at a 3/4 angle. So similar to when drawing a portrait, this gives me a fair amount of information. If this was directly facing me, then it would be very flat. If it was more of a profile, it'd be difficult to see that form. But out of this 3/4 view, I can see kind of the round quality of it, as well as the shape of the petals coming out from the center there. So it just gives me a bit more information to work with as I'm building the drawing. The other thing about this reference photo that I liked is that there's a clear distinction between light and shadow. With the light coming in from this angle, from this direction, we see this surface being struck by light, and we see distinct areas where this is in shadow, and that's going to help me a lot as we get farther into the drawing. So those are some of the things that I look for when looking for reference photos or taking reference photos myself. Yeah, again, if you are new to this whole series, I think we're on episode 29. So you're welcome to go back and check any of those old recordings. This goes up as a recording afterwards, so you can come back and review it as much as you'd like. So I encourage you all to follow along, but you can certainly just kind of sit back and watch and then apply this later to your own work. So we're going to get started, and I'm just going to be using the soft vine charcoal. And my objective here is to get rid of the white of the page, but rather than just do a full kind of tone over it, I want to start to wrap my head around some of the basic proportions. So I can just use this as an opportunity to help understand the form that I'm looking at in front of me. And I think it's really healthy at this stage to just kind of keep things loose and gestural. This is more to do with getting your mind around the overall form and becoming familiar with the object than anything. And like I said, the final goal is to basically just to get charcoal on the page, to get rid of that white. But we can also use this as an opportunity to quickly become kind of familiar with some of these forms here. So thinking very gesturally, this is all about moving my eyes quickly back and forth between the subject and the drawing, between the reference photo and the drawing. and just reacting to what I'm seeing, letting my eyes kind of follow along, moving around the image, and reacting very quickly. There's nothing precise happening here. This is all just very quick kind of studies and reactions to it. And you can see that I'm really just building up this, this overall tone. One of the things I also have to think about in this drawing is what I want to do with that background. I do like that it's fairly dark against the light sunflower. Even the sky, that blue sky, is darker in value than the light striking the petals there. And so I need to figure out what I'm going to do with that. So again, this is just kind of quick marks using the side of my hand to wipe this down. And I'm not worried about getting back to that bright white or preserving that white at this point. So here, and if you have any questions, you feel free to call them out in all caps. I see a question here about the paper that we're using. This is what I'm using today. It says Hahnemuhle. It's called Sketch or Skiza paper, and it's 100% pure cotton rag. This is my preferred paper for working in charcoal. You know, not that other papers aren't, you know, effective, but what I like about cotton rag papers is just that there's a softness to the texture. So instead of a wood pulp making the paper, it's actual cotton, and there's a particular feel to it that I like. It lends itself to creating atmosphere. You can get some precise detail, but not as much as with perhaps a really smooth paper. I have it also, if you're new, you'll find that there's a list of the materials I'm using in the description below in the video. So what I'm doing now is, again, taking another pass, and I'm almost thinking about this as a series of gestures. I said series and my Siri turned on, so that happens. So I'm just thinking about this as a sequence of gestures that some artists prefer to do this on a separate piece of paper, just to kind of loosen up, warm up, and I think it's really helpful to do that. I'm a little bit rusty in this today, and so I'm feeling the need to really just kind of move my body a bit and get used to the just the act of drawing. And so, and as I'm doing this, what I'm doing is here in the middle is thinking about that center of the sunflower, that overall form, and where I want to place it. It's not right in the middle; it's just a little bit off to the left, and starting to think about the general shape of these petals as they come off. And a lot of what's happening here is my eyes are just moving very quickly back and forth. And what happens when you do that, it's almost like the reference photo and the image overlap, or the drawing and the reference photo overlap. And it helps to become aware of some of the proportions. And I like how dark this gets against the light petals over here. And I'm trying to think about the overall shape more than the individual petals as much as possible. And one of the things I like about this paper as well is that you can see the vine charcoal is fairly light, but you know, on some papers, a smoother paper, it might just kind of wash off entirely. But I feel like in this one, it creates this nice haze on the paper that, you know, it keeps it on there, but it's not a very dark charcoal. Okay, so now I'm feeling a bit more confident about the placement of this. I have a good sense of the overall scale that I want to draw the flower at. I might make this a little bit smaller. And what I'm observing too, and you can see this in the reference photo, it might be not necessarily be apparent at first, but as you look at the center here, there is a distinction between light and shadow. So you can see the light's a bit stronger here, and then this whole area falls into shadow. And we get a little bit of these light spots and these dots that I need to figure out what I'm going to do with that, if that's something I want to really focus on as part of the drawing. But what I want to see first is that overall form here. So we have a question about, do you need to cover the page with charcoal? That's not necessary. I mean, you want to find something that works for you. This is, you know, really just kind of the approach that I chose for today. And there may be days when I might choose a different approach. But I think one of the advantages to covering the page with charcoal is that it starts from a place of unity, in that everything starts to emerge out of that layer of charcoal. And especially with a subject like this, where there's so many parts to it, it's easy for everything to fall apart and become fractured. We start to, all of the individual petals, for example, might feel kind of distinct and separate rather than part of one overall sunflower. And so for me, I think that sense of unity is going to be really critical. And I may stop this drawing a little bit earlier than you might feel comfortable with, so you might want to continue on when I'm done, adding even more detail to your work. But I feel like if we start from a place like this, where it's just big blocks of light and shadow, then it helps to ensure that everything remains unified. Everything kind of holds together as a singular flower rather than a series of disjointed petals on the page, if that makes sense. That's one of the challenges with detail, is that it's really easy to overwhelm the drawing with too much detail. A big thing about this drawing too is going to be the use of positive and negative space. So at this point, I'm really just trying to kind of orient myself, providing some general understanding of light and shadow. And then we're going to go back through and add some detail. So what I was working on over here is I'm drawing the petals as a positive shape against that background. And here, where we get light striking those petals, I'm going to actually flip my thinking and start drawing the negative space around them. And this is a really good subject if you're kind of new to that concept. This is a great way to understand the relationship between positive and negative space. And it's one of those things that can be really helpful in drawing, is being able to switch back and forth between thinking both positively and negatively. And at this point, I'm not necessarily thinking about counting every petal and making sure I have them all correct. I want to get marks on the page that I can then adjust later. And here, as we move underneath the flower, you can see up here we have a dark background against the light petals. As we come under here, now we have a more challenging situation in terms of those value relationships. This gets lighter, we have the shadow here, and it's difficult to determine what we're looking at in terms of those value relationships. So I'm to have to make a decision there to help define those petals. And if you are following along and say you only have graphite, you don't have the charcoal, you just kind of do your best to try to kind of internalize these concepts. But I think it's really healthy just to kind of follow along your, go with your instinct there. You start to develop your own instincts, and you want to be able to trust those as well. I mean, the whole point of the series is for us to come together and draw together, and you may find a different approach works better for you. And for those of you who have been with the series for a while, you'll have heard me say, but the alternating sequence of lights and darks is really a critical thing in a drawing. So looking at these patterns that are forming on the page, and you can start to think about them abstractly, and looking for a pleasing pattern in those lights and darks. And what is pleasing to you starts to become subjective. You're going to decide for yourself what kind of works for you. This is kind of a critical orientation point. That stem there leading up to that leaf. So I'm starting to become more specific. And again, for those of you who have been with the series, you'll have heard me say this before, but drawing is really about the image emerging on the page. We're pulling the image out onto the page. That's the approach that I'm taking here. So I prefer this way over creating an outline and then filling it in, again, because it leads to a sense of unity. I just like to get my hands dirty, especially with charcoal. It's a medium that some people find more challenging to work with. and that's totally understandable. But I enjoy getting my hands dirty, in part because this is the way I think when I'm painting as well. And a lot of what we're doing here in the series is building our skills here so that we can then apply it to other media. So if you're a watercolor painter, pastel, oils, acrylic, etc., having solid drawing skills can help with that. All right. Excellent as well. So I'm just checking here for any questions. There's a question about the pencils. I'm using charcoal here. If you want to go in the description for the video, you'll find a bit more information. You'll find the complete materials list. But if you have graphite, pen and ink, again, we're all here to kind of draw together. So I'd say grab whatever materials you have, and we can work on this. Also, check out artistnetwork.com. So I'm with Artist Network. We have a page built out on Artist Network. At the very top, you'll find a link to Drawing Together, which is the name of this series. And on that page, you'll find links to additional drawing resources, as well as individual show pages where it's been really fun watching people share the images that they've been creating as they've been following along in the videos. So check those out. There's some excellent work being posted there. So each of the show pages has its own thread. All right, so now what I'm doing in that pursuit of that balance between positive and negative space, I'm taking my kneaded eraser and I'm starting to draw kind of negatively in a way. I'm thinking about pulling out the lights now that I have that toned ground. And this is another opportunity now to start to refine the proportions. So again, moving my eyes back and forth very quickly, I'm trying to erase out some of the areas of light and shadow. It gets a little bit trickier in some of these areas here. This is when it's helpful to try to establish landmarks in the drawing. And so what I mean by that is when you're placing your marks, they're all in relationship to other marks that are on the page or other parts of the flower. And so having what I call landmarks established, those become places that you go to before you start to place a mark. So I kind of like this kind of twisty petal right here. This one right here is the one I'm working on. I'm going to set that as a landmark. And then as I move around the drawing, I'm constantly trying to evaluate where these marks are in relationship to that. And then I have other landmarks down in here. I can find kind of specific petals that I can use as landmarks. And then before I place my marks, I can quickly do a mental check to see where is this new mark relative to that? Is it in the right spot? And that can happen both positively and negatively. So as I'm erasing out some of these forms, I'm starting to refine the marks a little bit more. But so much of drawing is about that. It's about comparing one thing to another. And it's easy with this subject like this to get stuck on drawing one individual petal, then moving on to the next one, and then moving on to the next one. The danger in that is that it's easy to lose the forest for the trees. It's easy for then the drawing to become disjointed as a whole. Maybe one of the petals gets too big, the others get too small, and next thing you know, everything's out of whack. So it's healthy to do these quick check-ins before you place a mark. Do a quick scan around the drawing. So as I'm looking at the negative spaces in here, for example, doing a quick check-in and see, am I in the right spot relative to other aspects of the drawing. And some of these are going to be off, and you gradually adjust. And you always want to assume that they're incorrect. That we get into trouble when we place something and we think, all right, we got it, and stop looking at it critically. because there's, as you move through the drawing, as you change things on one side of the drawing, it's going to affect other parts of that drawing. And so you may have made it correct. I may have made these petals the correct shape, but then as I adjust things over here, it may actually affect the scale and proportions of what I've already created. So you always want to be checking. Doubt is a healthy thing to have. You can start to see now the shape is starting to come together. So, and for me, what I like seeing is that it's starting to be built on an understanding of the light and shadow. Light and shadow is a great way to unify a drawing, really kind of especially seeing how the shadows can accumulate together. So I'm still using the vine charcoal, and what happened here is I'm scratching and nothing's happening. So there's something in that charcoal, and I hear this a lot from students. This is a natural material. Vine charcoal is made from grapevines, and so there's going to be some impurities in there, and that's just to kind of be expected. So all you have to do is just rotate it and get away from that impurity. I can feel it in my fingers. It's rough right there. As I roll, all of a sudden I hit this nice soft patch in that charcoal. So just so you're aware that that's what happens very often in drawing. So still doing some negative drawing. I'm going to have to lighten up this sky area a little bit, but I think my objective right now is to get rid of that value. I want to get rid of that light. I want to really see that negative space. Again, moving my eyes back and forth very quickly, and I'm back around to that kind of teardrop shape there. What's going to be really helpful too is getting rid of the outlines in this drawing overall. So I'm trying to think in terms of shape rather than line as much as possible. And if that's kind of a term that you're not really kind of familiar with, there's different ways to create a form. So you can see what I did here as I'm using my eraser, I created a shape. So rather than creating a line and then filling it in, it's trying to really observe that shape as much as possible. And a drawing is going to have a combination of line and shape work. The lines don't exist in nature, though. They're an abstract construct. So if you're looking for realism in your drawing, consider getting rid of those outlines, getting rid of contour lines. So now you can see I kind of wipe that down, taking another stab, and now I'm just erasing out the shape of the lights. So again, doing some negative drawing. And then we have this one here. There's a thin sliver of light. And then as this starts to take shape, we're going to gradually refine the drawing. So, and with this kneaded eraser right here, I'm just kind of lightly scraping it so it's blending more than anything. And then where I need to bear down more, I can just kind of lean into it and extract a little bit more of that charcoal. And it's, for me, it works best to move around the drawing. Try not to get stuck in one spot too long. I find that I become more blind to the object the more I stay in one spot. And what I kind of mean by that is that I start to make kind of assumptions, and I stop really looking critically the more I stay in one spot. I become less willing to kind of change things. So as I'm erasing this out, I'm really trying to be careful not to erase too much. This area is still largely in shadow compared to the highlights here, and you can see that in the reference photo. And so I'm trying to kind of make sure that I don't become too heavy-handed. Down in here, the light starts to become a little bit stronger. Get these twists and turns. All right, and one of the things that's healthy right now is that, like, as I kind of work my way around counterclockwise around the sunflower, I seem to end up where I needed to. Everything seemed to line up generally pretty well. So as I'm looking at some of the shapes of the light and dark, as I come across, I'm connecting back to the petals that I had established earlier. And so that's a good sign. When I did my preparatory drawing, that didn't happen when I got to this stage. I was way off. It's like I had eliminated 3 or 4 of the petals, and I could have let it sit like that. I think that would have been fine overall, but it distorted the overall structure of the sunflower in a way that I wasn't comfortable with, and so I went back and I corrected it. You know, and something in an object like this, leaving out a petal or two is really not going to make a big difference in the overall understanding of the shape and the expression of the sunflower. It's, you know, something to consider when you're in nature and you're observing the sunflower. Very few of us are there actually counting every petal and looking at the very specific details. Instead, we're kind of soaking in the overall experience, looking at the color, the shape, the form, the whole environment, etc. And so you want to decide for yourself how you want that to be expressed in your drawing. All right, so I think, let's see. Linda's asking a question, I have trouble bending those petals and leaves. Is there a trick or a shading to it? That's exactly something that we're going to get to as we go through. So if we can start to see the general shape right now the next pass is to go through and start to add a bit more detail and refinement. So I've got the overall shape pretty well established. Now I can go back in and I can start to render individual petals, and that's where we can get those curves and stuff and such. So before I do that, I do want to kind of lock in this central part of the flower. And unfortunately, I do not know the scientific terminology of these other than the petals. Right? So I was not paying attention in my science classes when I was younger. So on this side, I still want to be thinking positively and negatively. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of working on that background. I'm just going to keep this fairly rough right now. I really kind of like that contrast of the background being loose and sketchy, and then getting more detailed as we move in here. So you can see that I'm using the side of the pencil. That helps me to cover a large area more effectively. And it also helps to actually sharpen this point. So then as I move from the outside in, I can start to roll my pencil up and engage the tip a bit more, where I get more control. And so what I've done now is I've kind of locked onto this as a landmark. So that's this petal right here. And I'm going to look for that shape. If I do some kind of negative drawing here, I can overstate that. So make that too big, come back in, and then refine that form. Again, thinking negatively. So I'm looking at the space around that petal, and I'm refining that shape. And I want to be careful with those marks. So what I was observing there is I was following along the contour of that petal, and that could cause me trouble in the end. What would happen is that background could pop forward because of that. Whenever I can, what I should be doing is running my marks in that background in a direction that's contrary to the contour of the flower. So if we have an edge that runs this direction, I should be turning my pencil and running those background marks at about a 90-degree angle. And that'll help to create a visual differentiation between those two. So here I'm just thinking about that path of the next flower or next petal. Maybe erasing this out a little bit more. As something I see quite a bit in students' work is, very effective value control, getting the right values, getting the right shapes, but just by changing the direction of the marks, it can go a long way in bringing the whole drawing together. So be looking at the shapes as they are in different places in space. And so in this case, when I'm drawing here, this is way back. And so I want to have marks that one in one direction that's contrary to the edges in that sunflower, and that'll help to pop that forward. So I'm just kind of working my way around now. And now that I've established the big forms in the drawing, I can really start to hone in on the individual petals and the particular shapes of those, and be less concerned about where things are in relationship to one another, because I've already established those big relationships. So that's one of the big advantages to taking the time to really just focus on the overall form. And so when I along in here, as I'm exploring that path for these petals, I'm trying to be really careful not to overstate those lines. I think it's going to get me into trouble if I make those lines too dominant at this stage. I'm going to come back in later and make more refined marks, more refined line work to define the edges. So as I do this here, as I'm looking for that shape of that petal, I want to keep those marks really light, because I want those lines that I just laid down to ultimately be consumed by that background value. And so we're just going through and kind of refining this. Now here we see this kind of play between light and dark here that I want to be mindful of. It gets really difficult to see when I'm working in the shadows of some of these petals, whether that value is lighter or darker than that sky. And so right now I'm up at this point right here, so I'm drawing this shadow, and it feels like that shadow is darker in value than that blue sky. As we come across here, that feels like it's still slightly darker than that. But what I've already established over here is that this is darker than those highlights. That sky area is darker. So I need to be really kind of sensitive to this and play around with that. And that's where I might ultimately define those edges by the use of line. I hope the leaf blowers and other lawn tools aren't loud. They're kind of coming and going. I can hear them outside. It's a beautiful day here in Colorado, so the lawn work is getting done. I love seeing where everybody's coming from too. People from all over the world joining in. A lot of people called out where you're from early on in the event. But if you haven't already, I'd love to see where you're joining us from. All right, so I'm kind of getting stuck on this one right here, this petal. I need to be careful of that. I found myself kind of latching onto it too much, so I'm going to keep moving around. That can happen. I like to think about the expenditure of energy as we go through, and ultimately where I want to put my energy, because it's really easy to kind of spin wheels. I find that what can happen is in this area is I find my brain wanting to latch onto that one petal, but I'm not quite there in my mind understanding what it looks like, what that shape is. And it's so easy to burn a lot of energy when you find that if you just kind of move around the drawing and come back to it, it'll click. And so I think about that a lot when I'm working, is moving back and forth, and coming back to things and seeing if the solution becomes more apparent, in terms of how to render something, what the value is, what that form is, etc. So I had to kind of force myself to do that. This is when my kind of the more detailed mind wants to start to take over. But my understanding of the flower isn't there yet. I don't really know what I'm looking at yet. That's going to come as we continue to refine this drawing. So a lot of negative drawing in here. It starts to get darker in that background against the lighter, the lighter petals there. All right, Wilma made a comment there about the white of the paper. What's fascinating too is about value relationships is that this is really not all that white. There's quite a bit of value still actually built up on there, but our brain starts to calibrate to those other values. It's one of the things that it's really difficult to kind of convey to students in my beginning drawing classes. And that's where I would kind of have to force them to tone the paper first, because then it really starts to click. But with the white of the paper, it's so white. We can't get any lighter than that in our drawing for most of the time, unless we're working with a white chalk, for example. But when we're working with charcoal or graphite, you can't get any lighter than that. And right away, our eyes calibrate to that that value relationship, to that white, and that can impact how we perceive the other values. Every other mark we make on the page is going to feel darker than it actually is because it's in the context of all that white. And often what I find is that if we can get to a gray, even if it's just a light gray, we become more sensitive to the subtle variations in value. We perceive those grays a bit more effectively. So by the same token, like a very dark drawing, the lights are going to feel lighter than they might otherwise because they're in the context of all that dark. Again, our brain calibrates to those value relationships. And so we understand that we see this as being the lightest light on the page, so our brain automatically says white. We see this as being the darkest dark on the page, so it automatically says black, even though we could probably go even darker here, and we can make this even lighter if we need to. So it's all about kind of, like I said, calibrating to those values rather than really seeing them objectively. It's kind of like having perfect pitch in music. It's a very difficult thing. With perfect pitch, you can, somebody can hear a note out of context and say that's a C or a D or whatever. It's very difficult to do that, or nearly impossible with values, because we're always relating one value to its environment, and it adjusts and affects how we perceive that. And the same is true with color, which is what makes color so awesome. We're always calibrating. All right, so we're going to start to really deal with these folds coming up soon. So here I'm having a really hard time seeing the value relationships between them. So I'm actually going to start to work in some lines. So I'm kind of defining these petals by giving them an outline. But I need to be really careful with that. And if you can start to see the general shape. So here in this petal under here, there's a shape of that light, and then it wraps around into this darker side of the petal. Thinking abstractly and just kind of trusting the shapes that you're reacting to is really healthy now as well. It's really easy to kind of start to let the drawing process take over. We stop looking and we just kind of get sucked into making marks on there. And what happens at that point is then we stop looking at the subject. There's a tendency for us to start to stop looking too early because we get absorbed in the mark making. It can be such a seductive thing sometimes just to make marks. And next thing you know, we've kind of lost our place in the drawing. We stopped looking at what we're actually doing. So now I'm going back through and I'm looking for some general shapes of light and shadow. This is a really light touch right now that I'm using. It's just the weight of the pencil on the paper. And you can see I'm kind of losing some of the highlights here. There's going to be some highlights I'm going to pull out in here. But I'm going to pull those out a little bit later. All right, so this is a good spot, I think, right now to actually get just some dark value in here. I'm just going to have fun making marks here. This is going to be very loose and abstract back here. And gestural. I think that's just what I'm feeling today. So if you're following along, you may want to make this a bit more detailed and more specific in here, but there's going to be more detail here, and that's going to get me anxious, so I need a place where I can just kind of move my arms a bit in the drawing, if that makes sense. All right, because I need to kind of clear my head before I dig back into this. So just, I think it's healthy sometimes if to just realize that making marks is fun. We kind of put so much pressure on ourselves sometimes to make those marks be detailed and fully rendered, but sometimes just letting loose and having fun on the page can be really satisfying. Here there's a little bit of light on that leaf, and so I'm starting to just suggest some of that a little bit. So really light touch with that kneaded eraser. Okay, all right, that helped. That helped just kind of loosen things up. So, all right. Let's see. Phyllis is asking, would a black and white reference be easier? I think it would be easier. And so that's where you, as the artist, can decide ultimately what your objective is for the drawing. For me, I enjoy the challenge of translating the colors into value, and it's a particular skill that becomes it just becomes more challenging when working from life. And so I'm using this as an opportunity to sharpen my skills from when I'm painting and working from life. I do a lot of plein air painting. And so I've kind of chosen to keep that as a challenge, to translate the values of the color into the values in the drawing. So if you would like to work from a black and white version of this, though, I think that's totally fine. So now what I'm doing is I'm using my shading stump, just utilizing on its side. I am starting to refine some of these values, and what I'm looking at are the shapes of the shadows within each petal. And I'm going to be erasing out some of the lighter spots a little bit later. And just like with charcoal, the more pressure I place on this, the darker mark it's going to be, and I'm rolling it in my fingers to kind of get to a new section of that shading stump as I go. And this is where it starts to get a little bit more subtle. In this shadow area, for example, there's some subtle variations in light and dark. And I find that the shading stump helps to keep things a bit more subtle, so I don't overstate them. And this is where I'm starting to think kind of more sculpturally about it. I'm trying to look for those folds and the curves, and where it kind of scoops in, try to scoop my marks, where it kind of bulges out, kind of round them out a little bit more, if that makes sense. And then this is really where I'm losing that form, because it's so subtle, the difference in values between that sky and the background. So what I need to do is do some negative drawing in here. I'll lighten that sky a little bit, losing that form, and then right in here there's more light striking that flower. So hopefully you can see that form starting to take shape. Now I'm working in that negative space around that form. And then this needs to come down. I'm seeing some changes I need to make in terms of the proportions. I'm looking for this overall shape of light striking that petal. There's a really thin kind of sliver of a petal there. You know, one of the things that you might be struggling with is if you're kind of new to working with the sunflower, is that we have this natural tendency to want to make our marks evenly spaced and look for rhythm and symmetry in our drawings. And so there's a tendency to want to make each petal the same shape, the same size, and just kind of rotate around. It's a very natural instinct that I have to fight quite a bit, and kind of forcing myself to try to see the individual shapes of the petals there and break that symmetry. Again, it's just something that it's very natural for us to do. So this might be a good spot to kind of check that in your drawing and see have you kind of unintentionally created symmetry and kind of a consistent rhythm in your drawing. I'm going to use my shading stump over here that just picks up charcoal onto this so that I can draw with it more easily. And you yourself are going to decide what your tolerance is in terms of accuracy. You know, where do you feel there, that you need to have it be exact and precise, and where you can kind of be more suggestive and gestural in your mark making. So you can ask yourself, is this the right shape? Is this the right value? Is it close? Does it capture the overall essence of it? Does it need to be precise? All right, so again, trying to move my way around the drawing without getting stuck too much in any individual one, because we're just going to keep going through pass after pass at this drawing. All right, welcome everybody. See, Linda, you're saying that it feels like a change of the direction of the flower. It's entirely possible. I think we'll see how this all comes together. I'm going to try to trust the shapes that I have, but it almost feels, yeah, sometimes it can feel like it's being inverted. Get a little bit more. I'm just utilizing the side of the pencil here. I need to work out these petals here right at the very top. I think what I need to do is erase that down. Here we go. Do some negative drawing. One of the nice things about the kneaded eraser is I can kind of pinch it into kind of more distinct shapes. It's not a very sharp edge, but it's nice that I can kind of shape it the way I want to and start to really think about how that translates to the object that I'm looking at. All right, I think again because it's difficult to determine the value relationships up here, I'm going to have to lock this down at some point. What am I going to do here? I think what I need to do is create a bit of an outline to really see the forms of these petals, because it's gotten too abstract, I think. It's not quite enough form here. Sorry, I'm just trying to think through this one. It's just this area is requiring a bit more focus. I think what I want to do is a very light line, very thin. I want to try to kind of capture the overall shapes here. This is where I do need to use line a bit more to define that edge, just because I'm not confident in my understanding of the value relationships. And so my hope is that if I keep these lines light, it's enough to kind of sharpen them up without without throwing off the value relationships too much, if that makes sense. So it's difficult to see what I want to do here in terms of how dark to make that sky versus how light to make the light on the flowers there, on the petals. So now I'm just kind of getting a little bit bogged down in the details here, but I feel like that's necessary up in here. And there's this. So I think I need to bear it down a little bit. Needed erase. I got my rubber eraser here where I need to bear down a little bit more. There we go. So I want to be just really careful. If I overstate the outlines in some of these areas, it's going to flatten things out. So I feel like it's holding up all right now, but I need to be really careful with that. And then there's a shadow that gets crossing over here. I love that shape of that shadow. All right, bring this back in. So if you're utilizing a shading stump, remember you're always contributing to the form. It's not necessarily a matter of building up value with the pencil and then just kind of smoothing it out. This is an opportunity to actually be drawing with the shading stump, and you're contributing to that form. Again, I want to be careful with those outlines, but I feel like that's enough to define that edge there. How are we doing on time? Yeah, we're about almost an hour in. I think maybe another half hour or so should be sufficient for this. I want to be careful as I work into here. This area here is much, much lighter in value than this. Even the lightest parts in this area is still kind of in shadow compared to that. So I need to be mindful of that as I go. All right, and I love this overhand grip when I'm working. Just kind of scraping it across. I feel like it makes a bit more kind of organic marks. And it gives me a bit more mobility, I feel like, than when holding it when writing with this tripod grip. So if you're kind of new to drawing, check out different ways to hold the pencil to give you a bit more mobility. I'm really trying to utilize my arm more. Like here, I'm utilizing my wrist, which, I think it's gonna give me trouble in the end. So I need to kind of be mindful of my drawing with the whole arm. All right, back to the shading stump. And this gets really kind of tricky in here, seeing the play between light and dark, and my mind wants to go in and use the eraser in here, but I got to tell myself, no, that's going to exaggerate the values. It's not that light. I need to darken areas around those lights more than anything at this stage. So for example, with this, if I need to define that edge more, I can darken the space around it rather than lift it with, pulling out more light using the eraser. Oof, forgot about the direction of my marks there. I started following the contour of that petal a bit too much. All right, I think I'm just gonna have some fun with that background. Don't want to get too consumed with rendering that background. We have enough to tackle with this flower. I'm just gonna let that background go. And again, one of the things I like about this grip is I can move from the side to the point really easily. And I think that's really helpful at this stage. So doing some negative drawing in here, thinking about the shape around the petals more than the petals themselves, letting that define the forms. And this is a really interesting curl right in here. So really look for those compound curves. The idea that it moves from concave to convex and around, that's ultimately what creates those. So for example, this curl right in here, you can see how we have this, it kind of pushes in this direction, and then it switches gears and it curves this direction and then back around. So it's like this S curve, but really kind of locking into those is what's ultimately going to create that that detail, the form of the petals. All right. Whew, here we go. We're going to keep making passes around the drawing. And refining the values. And I think, yeah, I kind of like having some areas of looseness in this. I feel like I just need it for the drawing, not for the image, for the act of the drawing. And that's something to also consider as well, is that I like to be thinking about that. There's the drawing, and then there's drawing. And the result, the physical drawing, is a record of the drawing process. And so I think it's important to be aware of that as you're working, that this is all a record of the drawing process. If you're not having fun, I feel like that's going to show up in the drawing itself, in the final object. And so, think about, if what balance you'd like to strike there in your own work. How much of it is it about the physical drawing, just the beauty of the object itself, and making sure you capture that, and how much of it is the act of drawing. Let's see. And I think for me, I tend to prioritize the act over the result. I just think drawing, painting itself is just the physical action of that is a worthwhile pursuit, and more than the final object. But again, that's something that you want to define for yourself. But I think it's healthy to make that a conscious choice in your work, so that when you're working, you're making kind of definitive statements. All right, let's see. I have to do some refinement in there. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know how many of you are painters as well, but you get a lot of questions about, when I'm painting, do I draw it first and then color in on top? And I typically don't. I try to actually build it very similar to the way I'm drawing, to start layering colors and fairly loose, and then gradually making them more refined, and adjusting the color. But I don't often kind of create a drawing and then cover it over. That's just my preference, in part because let's see, I'm trying to, I guess I feel like it makes for a more unified painting, and it becomes about the act of painting more when I do that, rather than simply a means of getting the final result. So you can make a, I love the idea of working things out on the canvas. I had a professor in college that would say, you got to go into the mud and then pull it back out. And I love that analogy of making a mess on the canvas, and then it emerging back out, and you come up with something that's really rich. There's a potential for richness in there that I really like, rather than almost in a way drawing it becomes too comfortable for me. I lose that sense of discovery of something happening on the canvas. When I draw it, then I know everything's going to work out, and I get a bit too particular in my drawing when I do that. So I almost like that, the feeling of everything feeling it's going to fall apart, and then you just keep working on it, and then it comes together. I try to think about drawing as though, in drawing and painting, as I'm working on it, almost like I'm discovering the materials for that first time. What can they do? What are new color combinations? What are new brush work? What brush marks that I can be utilizing? How does this stuff work? And it doesn't lead to a very good painting, but it leads to really fun time painting. So that's just my way of thinking about it. All right, let's see. So now I'm just looking for some of that negative spaces, some of the negative spaces in there. All right, I'm feeling like something is off in here. I need to figure out how to correct it, some of these proportions. And so what I notice about this curl right in here is there's just that nice compound curve where it curves this way, and then it bends a little bit, but then it curves this way again. It's almost like it's two overlapping curves that create that. Erasing that out. Values are a bit exaggerated in this. It's pretty dark in this drawing here, so I need to lift that out using my kneaded eraser. I can start to lighten up some of these areas where perhaps that value is a bit strong. And let me need to think through what's happening here with these petals. There's one kind of underneath here. And I feel like it gets a little bit lighter again here in that background, and then against the darker petals. Oh, all right. Well, I'm glad to hear that or see that comment about determining the value shifts. You know, looking for that alternating sequence of light and dark is really helpful, I think. It's difficult in painting, I know for me. I start to lose that. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping that I can carry over into my painting more is that awareness. Because in painting, especially when I'm starting to mix color, I start to get consumed by trying to mix the correct color that, and I start to lose the an understanding of the value relationships. Yes, yes. Who is that talking about watercolor there? Yeah, having effect, drawing. I think it's really helpful in all media, because really, ultimately, what drawing becomes about is about proportions, perspective, form, things like that are inherent in other media. Like I said, when we're working with color, that can start to kind of dominate the practice a bit. And so sometimes by practicing drawing, it becomes more automatic in the painting process, is that you start to kind of react. It's almost like more about building hand-eye coordination than anything, and that's really a helpful thing with drawing. I'm going to start to just kind of loosen up here. Again, I feel like I just need to clear my head a little bit before I get back into the petals there. I was kind of losing my focus. So I want to keep things fairly loose and light. Just having fun with marks here. So just thinking about the shapes here. That's not the right shape, but that's all right. Working in that background here. And I want to be careful not to overstate some of these values. I don't want these values to be as bright as these. I don't know what shape that was not the right shape, but we'll call it good. I just made that mark. I could feel myself just kind of getting caught up in the mark making, and I wasn't looking, and so this is off right in here, and I think that's going to be all right. It feels like it captures the space effectively enough, but I do want to kind of call that out for you. It's okay to get caught up in mark making and just have fun with it. So, and it's interesting to see what materials we all gravitate to. I primarily work in oils, but I've done quite a bit of work in acrylic and then also pastel. I've tried watercolor, and it's really hard for me, and so I haven't really committed to understanding watercolor enough, and so I think I need to give that a shot. I've worked with some great artists in watercolor, and it just blows my mind how they make that work. But for whatever reason, oils tends to stick with me, and when I'm drawing, I keep coming back to charcoal. I've done quite a few graphite drawings as part of this series, but I just keep coming back to charcoal. But it's good to shake it up sometimes. What I love about kind of working in pastel, for example, is, all the colors are there in your palette. They're already done. They're ready to go, and you got to find the right one. It's very difficult to mix color. And what I find is that then when I go back and I work in oils, that my awareness of color changes, and I feel like it helps my color mixing to be able to kind of think more like a pastelist. And so kind of I encourage you to, if you find yourself kind of locked into a medium, try shaking it up, try something different. Not so that you become a master of that medium, but that it allows you to walk away with something that you can apply to whatever medium you do prefer. I did find it when I do work in watercolor, I attack it the way I do oils. So I end up painting very thickly, and I don't have an understanding of washes the way some of the great watercolorists that I've worked with utilize them. And it's fascinating to see people, think in terms of watercolor where there's no barrier between the medium and their expression, because they just kind of becomes who they are. All right. Squinting, Rosalie, that's exactly it. Squinting helps a lot. Hi from Uruguay. So just checking here for any questions. So it sounds like there's a shuttle launch today, huh? I should probably be paying more attention. I've been trying to let the news stay out of my head a bit more lately, because it's challenging right now. All right, so I'm feeling a bit more confident in this area. So I need to define this a little bit more. I'm going to come back into this, but I think what I'd like to do is work on that central area and then come back in and make this the focal point. So I'm going to be doing some negative drawing and pulling out some of the highlights, but I want to kind of soften everything now, and I can see where those highlights are going to go. I'm going to come back into those a little bit later. But I am having a lot of fun just with the mark making in this one. I'm seeing areas where I'm off in the proportions, and I think I'm going to be fine with that for my, just for my own well-being. I think I want to let this just let it be what it is. I'm just having a lot of fun with this. And I worry that as I start to kind of become too critical over it, that I'm going to lose the fun in this. So there's a bit of negative drawing in here. So as I'm drawing that center of the flower, I'm trying to be aware of the shape it makes against those petals, because it's really the petals that I think are the most interesting to me. And so I'm utilizing that as a way to help with those forms. And that's going to help us to see the forms, I think, a bit more clearly. So like in these here where we see these folds, I'm really looking at that negative shape that is created here. Utilizing the side of the pencil. And it looks like if some of you have to go to watch a shuttle launch, this goes up as a recording, so you'll be able to check back on this later. And then right in here, I'm looking for this overall shape where it's kind of flat in this section, and then it drops in like a bowl here. So I'm trying to observe the shape of the light here in that bowl. And I could start to suggest this beautiful kind of concentric pattern that's happening here in the center. And now I can start to refine some of these forms in here by looking at these little bits of dark in between the petals there right at the base. And you'd be amazed. This is like drawing teeth, right? So there's a tendency to want to exaggerate and overstate individual petals. But if you just find these little bits of dark at the base where they meet at the center of the flower here, or in the case of teeth where it would be meeting the gums, that can be enough to suggest the forms. All right, so now let's see. Okay, so now what I want to do is use my rubber eraser to pull out some of these lighter spots. So it's just a quick, short kind of vibration on the page, and I'm not worried too much about making that form super detailed because I can come back in and refine them a little bit later. But before I do that, I'm just pulling out these highlights. And what may have already happened is that, seeing this eraser pull out the brighter whites, you may have already been kind of calibrating to these lights here and reading those as white. And so then it becomes really interesting then to see that become even lighter. And I'm kind of prioritizing the outer edges and the center of each of the petals as I'm pulling out these eraser marks to help reinforce that form. Let's see, I think I'm missing a petal in here. I wonder if that's going to be all right. I think that's going to be all right. Yeah, again, I'm seeing some areas that are a bit off. I'm missing this kind of twisted petal form in there, which I think I can get at with some negative drawing. So it's not quite right, but I feel like it does enough to suggest that form. I'll refine that here. And then pull this petal back in right on top of that using the eraser. And this gets a little bit brighter, but I really like what's happening with the value relationships here. And there's a nice kind of band here in terms of that creates that light. A thin little curling form that I've overstated with my eraser because it's such a blunt instrument, but that's all right. I kind of know that going into it. I'm not going to be able to erase out the perfect shape I need, so I'm going to overstate it and then cut that back down and refine it a little bit more. So. Oh, and there's that cool there's a little kind of S curve of light right in here. So again, I'm overstating that light. And then I can kind of bring shading in around it. And that makes that cool little curl of a form there. Now let's see what happens if I erase out some of the light up here. Hopefully that helps to differentiate it against the sky a little bit more. Just kind of working my way around the drawing. I'm trying to look for the approximate shapes rather than making a photographic kind of duplication of this. But I think that works out pretty well. It kind of captures that sense of light and shadow. And now I think what I can do is with the sharp point, kind of refine some of these forms a little bit. I lost a petal in here. What do I do here? Let me see. All right, this one needs to come down a little bit. And then do some negative drawing in here, reestablish that one that I lost. Just a little bit of line here and there to define that edge. Actually, what I need to do. And again, you're going to decide for yourself what your tolerance is in terms of accuracy, how far you want to go. I mean, I think for the purposes of this demonstration, I feel like this works out all right. I don't necessarily need to go back and fix every little detail, but I'll hang on for a little bit. So really what this stage is now is just kind of going through and continuing to refine some of these forms here. Using that eraser as a bit of a blunt instrument, I'm kind of going through and pulling out some of those highlights and sharpening up the edges a little bit. Part of with this rag paper that I've got, it lends itself to light and atmosphere, I feel, a bit more than kind of sharp detail. So, you know, if this was a smoother paper, it might be easier to get really sharp and crisp edges. So this may not be the right material for you. It is for me. I feel like what can happen when I have too much detail is that it can overwhelm the senses, and we get caught up in all those details, and we lose the overall form. So I feel like this kind of, because it lends itself to creating really these subtle and soft transitions, I can bring in sharp detail in a few areas, like right down in here, and then let other areas go. Let them become a bit more subtle, more atmospheric. I think I want to make that shadow here on this leaf a bit more dominant. So squinting my eyes to try to see that overall shape. I can use my eraser here to pull out, do some negative drawing on that leaf. And so in this case, you know, it's really not about making a copy of the photograph for me. You know, drawing, it's about making a drawing. It's about kind of extracting as much power out of the medium itself. You know, what is charcoal good at doing? You know, how does it feel? How can it express my kind of sensibility in terms of manipulating material? How can it be fun just to manipulate? And I feel like that's kind of important when choosing the medium, is really what are its strengths, what are its inherent characteristics, and then exploiting that to your advantage, making the drawing become about that. In this case, you know, the paper isn't really, doesn't really lend itself to creating this kind of hyper-real photographic representation. And the object itself, I feel like it's just so right just to have fun and become expressive with the marks. So I feel like it starts to align pretty nicely with that. If I was going for a true photographic copy, yeah, I might choose different materials here. So here I can erase that out too much. So I can just smudge it out a little bit, just lightly with my finger, to kind of drop those into shadow. They're a little sharper right here in that center. But you know, with oil paints, for example, they lend themselves to that beautiful kind of oily kind of texture that it can create. That luminosity, there's translucency, and there's the ability to mix precise color. With graphite, there's a silvery quality to it. There's the potential for precision because it's a harder material. With charcoal, you have a nice rich value range, and there can be a softness to it. I think this needs to be defined a little bit more. Kind of soften that up a little bit. I'm going to come back in here with my rubber eraser and see if I can define these forms a little bit more. And then just be careful with that outline here. So I hope my head's not getting in that way, but I just need this petal here. I feel like it becomes so visible when you have the yellow against the blue, but I'm not sure what to do with those values. So this is kind of perplexing me a little bit. I think that's what I want to do, is darken that side of that petal and darken that side. And that creates some differentiation there. Yeah, I like that mark. I'm going to leave that the way that is. Just keeping these light and loose. And I think maybe kind of some quick gestural marks to reference the shape of this leaf here. Feel like it's an intentional form. I think I'm just going to keep making these fairly light and gestural here. I'm looking up at the screen here because there's a projection, so this allows me to see what it looks like vertically. And also simulates kind of stepping back. So if you haven't been stepping back from your own work, I think it's healthy to do that. Yeah, so I feel like that's working out all right. We might just about call it a day. I don't know how you all feel about this. Let me see. Angie's saying to turn your paper. That is so hard with this. I'm glad you called that out. When I do my preparatory drawing, so when I did this one, this thing is moving all over the place on my board. But with this tape down for the camera, it becomes really challenging. And I'd recommend giving that a shot, because what it can do is it helps to build your hand-eye coordination in a different way. You learn how to move your hand in different ways to get the angles that you want, and you'll become more confident in that. But that's, I'm so glad you called that out. It's a challenge sometimes. In some drawings it's not a problem, but in this one I do find the desire to be able to turn it and just get my hand right in there to get the perfect curve that I want. Karen's asking about what brand of shading stumps I'm using, and honestly, I don't know. Let me see. It just says made in China, so I don't know. And it was so long ago that I bought these. I had these kind of kicking around for a while, so unfortunately, I don't quite know. But I'll see if I can track that down, and if I can, I'll post that in the description underneath the recorded video. You're welcome, everybody. JC is asking, how does your charcoal lay on top of each other? Mine tends to wipe one off as I add the other to it. That could be the paper. It sounds like a paper issue, that it's kind of slipping, so it's and that happens a lot in working with graphite. That's one of the reasons I like the charcoal, is I can build up the layers, and with the tooth of the paper it's going to hold it a little bit better. But what can happen is sometimes that layer of charcoal gets rid of the tooth, and then there's nothing for the subsequent layer to lay on top. And I find that in general, layering the vine charcoal first and then the compressed charcoal on top works. But then also in some areas where I've laid that compressed charcoal, if I go in with the vine charcoal, it can really help to hold that as well. I don't know what it is about the particular nature of the rag paper, but there's something to that the fact that as you work it's kind of filing off that top surface. It's a fairly thick paper, and so you can kind of get to a really nice surface that way. But it does sound like your paper, you might try just experimenting with a different type of brand of paper there. Sometimes the ones that are general all-purpose drawing papers it can prioritize one medium over the other, and it'll technically work for charcoal, but maybe it's not the optimal one for it. So hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, so Patty is saying your flower is looking clouded like the weather, but it allows me to contrast with the petals. Yeah, go for it. I think this isn't about copying the photo one-to-one. This isn't about creating a drawing that looks just like the photo. This is about using the photo as a reference to create a drawing. And so let it go where it needs to go. This has been a fun way for me to kind of explore the form a little bit more. It's not a form that I've really drawn or painted much. So it's been kind of fun to just kind of experiment and play around with that. But again, for me, it's about drawing, not the drawing. It's the act of drawing that's ultimately important. It's about being here, drawing together. It locks this experience in your mind a little bit more. So the act of drawing can be a really powerful tool. So Sharon's asking about what's possible with pastels. That's a really good question, and I think a lot of that comes down to the surface, I've noticed. So when I use a pastel matte card, kind of a cardstock, that tends to build up layers more effectively versus a pastel paper. And so each surface is going to have a certain tolerance for how many layers you can build up on one another. When I work with pastels, I don't necessarily layer a whole lot. I spend a lot of time carefully choosing the colors, and I might kind of tap it on the page to see how that color is working, and if that's working, then I'll kind of hit it, rather than sneaking up on the color and building it by layering it down, kind of gradually adjusting and shading and blending. I try to hit it more kind of quickly, but kind of really carefully choosing that. But I do know, in working with some of the pastel artists to create some videos for Artist Network, is that certain papers will be more forgiving in terms of layering than others. I think it was, Desmond O'Hagan uses the Canson Mitientes paper that he can get several layers built up on that. And then when I worked with Chris Ivers, she used a kind of a sanded paper and was really able to build up more on that. And then what you can do is you can kind of erase down, and you could or scrape off some of that layer of pastel if it's building up too much. JC, that you're using the mixed media paper. Yeah, try. So today you use the drawing paper. Yeah, so that mixed media paper, I've used the black one in this series, and that actually works pretty nicely. It doesn't necessarily hold the charcoal very strongly, but it allows for kind of multiple layers. But I give a cotton rag paper a shot if you can find some. Yeah, Sharon, that's exactly what we do. And we say when we're kids, it's all about the process and having fun exploring the materials. And then it's around age 11, 12 or so. That's when we start to make things want to feel correct. We want things to start to look correct, and then we start to become more critical. So it's a very natural kind of process that we all go through. But I think that it's the same with painting. I think there's something about the material itself that I like to engage in, and I like to let that show in the work, rather than make a painting that looks like a photograph. I want to make a painting that looks like a painting, like that reflects the inherent qualities of oil paint. All right, so thank you so much. So we're going to be meeting every Monday, Wednesday from now on. Kind of dropping the Friday. We were meeting 3 days a week. We have a lot in the series. So yeah, like I said, I believe this is episode 29. So if you haven't seen them, you can go back and check out the others in the series. I posted one last week, a recording drawing a bird that I'm not sure if you all have seen. If not, check that out. I think I want to add that. And like I said, you can check out artistnetwork.com where you can find the individual show pages and people have been sharing work that they've been working on. It's been really awesome to see. Let me see. I'm just gonna create some variation in this here, just rolling the kneaded eraser. That's kind of fun there. So I'm just checking out the drawing here to see how everything holds up in terms of the spatial relationships. Everything feels like it's in the space it needs to go, but I feel like overall it's working out all right. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. I will see you all back again on Monday. The schedule is up on the website. I can't remember what we're doing on Monday, but I have it all worked out. So go check that out, and we will join again 3 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be back to drawing together. So take some time drawing this weekend. Love to see what you're all working on, and I will see you all the next time around.